Hey friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Last episode, Axel was at death's door, and fortunately he awakes to see his uncle. He's survived, even if he's pretty badly beaten from falling down a giant tube of rocks. And this episode we get to see what he finally was curious about. When he was hearing waves breaking on a shore, he felt wind and he saw light coming through. This is going to be the episode we find out exactly what that was behind that tunnel. So enjoy chapter 30. Chapter 30. An Underground Sea. At first I saw nothing. My eyes, which had grown unaccustomed to light, abruptly closed. When I managed to open them again, I was more astounded than delighted. "The sea!" I cried. "Yes," said my uncle, "the Liedenbrock Sea, for I don't imagine that any other explorer is likely to dispute my claim for having discovered it, and my right to call it by my name." A vast sheet of water, the beginning of a lake or an ocean, stretched away out of sight. The deeply indented shore offered the waves a beach of fine golden sand, strewn with those little shells which were inhabited by the first living creatures. The waves broke on this shore, and with a sonorous murmur peculiar to huge enclosed spaces. A light foam was whipped up by a moderate wind, and some of the spray was blown into my face. From this gently sloping beach, about 200 yards from the waves, a line of huge cliffs curved upwards to incredible heights. Some of them, crossing the beach with their sharp spurs, formed capes and promontories, which had been eaten away by the teeth of the surf. Farther on, their massive outline could be seen clearly defined against the misty backcloth of the horizon. It was a real sea, with a capricious contour of earthly shores, but utterly deserted and horribly wild in appearance. If my eyes could range far out over this sea, it was because a very special kind of light revealed its every detail. It was not the light of the sun, with its dazzling shafts of brilliance and the splendor of its rays, nor was it the pale, vague glow of the moon, which is just a cold reflection. No. The power of this light, its tremulous diffusion, its clear, bright whiteness, its coolness, and its superiority as a source of illumination to moonlight, clearly indicated an electric origin. It was like an aurora borealis, a continuous cosmic phenomenon filling a cavern big enough to contain an ocean. The vault over my head, the sky, if you like, seemed to be composed of huge clouds, shifting and changing vapors which, as a result of condensation, must at certain times fall in torrents of rain. But just then the weather was fine. The electric light was producing some astonishing effects on the higher clouds. Their lower spirals were in deep shadow, and often, between two separate strata, a ray of remarkable brightness would shine down on us. But it was nothing like sunlight, seeing that there was no warmth in it. The general effect was supremely melancholy and sad. Instead of a sky shining with stars, I could feel that above these clouds there were a granite vault which oppressed me with its weight, and that space, vast though it was, would not have been large enough for the orbit of the humblest of satellites. Then I remembered the theory of an English captain who compared the earth to a huge, hollow sphere, inside which the air remained luminous as a result of its pressure, while two stars, Pluto and Proserpina, moved about on their mysterious orbits. Could he have been telling the truth? We were indeed imprisoned inside a huge cavern. It was impossible to gauge its width, since the shore stretched away on either side as far as the eye could see, or its length, for our gaze was soon halted by a somewhat indefinite horizon. As for its height, it must have been several miles. The eye could not see where the ceiling rested on its granite buttresses, but there were clouds hanging in the atmosphere at a height which I put at 12,000 feet, a greater altitude than that of the terrestrial clouds, and doubtless due to the great density of the air. Obviously, the word cavern cannot give any idea of the vast dimensions of this huge space, but human words are totally inadequate for anyone who ventures into the abysses of the earth. Besides, I did not know what geological theory could explain the existence of such a huge excavation. Could the cooling of the earth have produced it? I knew of certain famous caves from the descriptions of them given by travelers, but none of them had anything like the dimensions of this one. If the grotto of Gauchara in Colombia had not given up the secret of its depth to Humboldt, who had explored it to a depth of 2,500 feet, it probably did not go much farther down. The huge Mammoth Cave in Kentucky was admittedly gigantic in its proportions, since its ceiling rose 500 feet above the level of an unfathomable lake, and the travelers had gone 25 miles along it without coming to the end. But what were these cavities compared to the one which I was now admiring, with its cloudy sky, its electric light, and a vast sea contained in its depths? My imagination felt powerless before such immensity. I gazed at these marvels in silence, unable to find words to express my feelings. I felt as if I were on some distant planet, Uranus or Neptune, witnessing phenomena quite foreign to my terrestrial nature. New words were required for such new sensations, and my imagination failed to supply them. I gazed, I thought, I admired with such stupefaction, not unmixed with fear. The unexpected nature of this sight had brought back the flush of health to my cheeks. I was treating myself with astonishment and bringing about a cure by means of this novel therapeutic system. Besides, the keen, dense air was reinvigorating me by supplying extra oxygen to my lungs. It'll be easily appreciated that after an imprisonment of over 40 days in a narrow gallery, it was sheer bliss to breathe this moist, salty air. I had no reason to regret having left my dark grotto. My uncle, who was already familiar with these wonders, had ceased to marvel at them. "Do you feel strong enough to walk about a little?" he asked me. "Yes," I replied, "and I should like nothing better." "Then take my arm, Axel, and let us follow the windings of the shore." I eagerly accepted, and we began to skirt this new ocean. On the left, steep rocks, piled up one upon another, formed a prodigiously impressive heap of titanic proportions. Down their sides flowed countless cascades, which fell in loud, limpid sheets of water. A few light clouds of steam, passing from one rock to another, indicated the presence of hot springs, and streams flowed gently toward the common basin, murmuring delightfully as they descended the slopes. Among these streams I recognized our faithful companion, the Hansbach, which flowed quietly into the sea as if it had done nothing else since the beginning of the world. "We shall miss it in the future," I said with a sigh. "Nonsense," said the professor. "What does it matter whether we have that stream or another with us?" I thought this reply rather ungrateful. At that moment my attention was drawn by an unexpected sight. 500 yards away, at the end of a steep promontory, a tall, dense forest appeared. It consisted of trees of medium height, shaped like parasols with sharp geometrical outlines. The wind seemed to have no effect on their foliage, and in the midst of the gusts they remained motionless, like a group of petrified cedars. I quickened my step, anxious to put a name to these strange objects. Were they outside the 200,000 species of vegetables already known? And had they to be accorded a special place among the lacustrine flora? No. When we arrived under their shade, my surprise turned to admiration. I found myself, in fact, confronted with products of the earth, but on a gigantic scale. My uncle promptly called them by their name. "It's just a forest of mushrooms," he said. And he was right. It may be imagined how big these plants which love heat and moisture had grown. I knew that the Lycopodon giganteum, according to Bulliard, attains a circumference of 8 or 9 feet, but here there were white mushrooms 30 or 40 feet high, with the heads of an equal diameter. There were thousands of them. The light could not manage to penetrate between them, and a complete darkness reigned between those domes, crowded together as closely as the round roofs of an African city. Yet I wanted to go farther, though it was mortally cold under those fleshy vaults. For half an hour we wandered about those damp shadows, and it was with a genuine feeling of relief that I regained the seashore. The vegetation of this subterranean region was not confined to mushrooms. Farther on, a great many other trees with colorless foliage stood in groups. They were easy to recognize as the lowly shrubs of the earth, grown to phenomenal dimensions. Lycopodiums 100 feet high, giant sigillarias, tree ferns as tall as the fir trees in northern latitudes, and lepidodendrons with cylindrical forked stems, ending in long leaves and bristling with coarse hairs like monstrous cacti. "Astonishing! Magnificent! Splendid!" cried my uncle. "Here we have the entire flora of the secondary period of the world, the transitional period. Here are humble garden plants which were trees in the early ages of the globe. Look, Axel, and admire it all. Never has a botanist had such a feast for the eyes." "You're right, Uncle. Providence seems to have wanted to preserve this huge hothouse, the antediluvian plants which scientists have so skillfully reconstructed." "As you say, my boy, it is a hothouse, but you might add that it may be a menagerie, too." "A menagerie?" "Yes, a menagerie. Look at this dust we are walking on, these bones scattered on the ground." "Bones?" I exclaimed. "Why, yes. These are the bones of antediluvian animals." I fell on these primeval remains, composed of indestructible calcium phosphate, and unhesitatingly identified these gigantic bones, which looked like dried-up tree trunks. "Here is the lower jaw of a mastodon," I said, "and there is a femur which can only have belonged to the biggest of all those monsters, the Megatherium. Yes, it certainly is a menagerie, for these bones can't have been brought here by a cataclysm. The animals they belong to have lived on the shores of this subterranean sea, in the shade of these arborescent plants. Why, I can even see some whole skeletons. And yet—" "Yet what?" asked my uncle. "I can't understand the presence of such huge quadrupeds in this granite cavern." "Why?" "Because animal life existed on Earth only in the secondary period, when a sediment of soil had been deposited by the floodwaters and had taken the place of the incandescent rocks of the primitive period." "Well, Axel, there is a very simple answer to your objection, and that is this soil is alluvial." "What? At this depth below the surface of the Earth?" "Why, yes, and there is a geological explanation of the fact. At a certain period, the Earth consisted only of an elastic crust, which moved alternatively upwards or downwards according to the laws of attraction and gravitation. Probably subsidences of the crust occurred, and some of the alluvial soil was carried to the bottom of the abysses, which suddenly opened up." "Well, that must be it. But if antediluvian animals have lived in these subterranean regions, how do we know that some of those monsters are not still roaming about in these gloomy forests or behind these steep rocks?" As this idea occurred to me, I examined, not without a certain alarm, the various points of the horizon, but no living creature could be seen on those deserted shores. I was rather tired, so I went and sat down at the end of a promontory, at the foot of which the waves were breaking noisily. From there I could see the whole of the bay formed by an indentation on the coast. In its crook, a little harbor had been formed by the pyramidal rocks, where still waters slept sheltered from the wind. A brig and 2 or 3 schooners could have anchored there with room to spare. I almost expected to see some ship emerge from it under full sail and take to the open sea, with the southern breeze behind her. But this illusion rapidly faded. We were indeed the only living creatures in this subterranean world. When the wind dropped, a silence deeper than that of the desert fell over the arid rocks and weighed on the surface of the ocean. Then I tried to penetrate the mists in the distance and to tear away the curtain which hung across the mysterious horizon. A whole succession of questions rose to my lips. Where did the sea end? Where did it lead? Could we ever hope to reach its opposite shores? My uncle, for his part, had no doubt that we could. As for myself, I was torn between hope and fear. After spending an hour in the contemplation of this wonderful sight, we returned by way of the beach to the grotto, and it was under the influence of the strangest thoughts that I fell into a deep sleep. And that's the end of chapter 30.